In early April 2016, something mysterious happened. Dead fish began washing up on the beaches of Vietnam's Ha Tinh province. Not just a few, literal tons. And then dead fish began appearing elsewhere, all along Vietnam's 4 central provinces. This was an environmental crisis, but it was also an economic catastrophe. Citizens across the country stopped eating fish amid reports of poisonings and even deaths. The seafood industry was decimated. Hundreds of thousands of families who relied on the ocean for their livelihood were suddenly without income. Vietnam's prime minister called it the most serious environmental disaster Vietnam has ever faced. The country was gripped by a single burning question: what was killing the ocean? It didn't take long to find the answer. A Taiwanese company was pumping waste directly into the ocean. Local fishermen discovered an underwater discharge pipe, allowing a local steel plant operated by Formosa Ha Tinh Steel Corp. to dump waste into the ocean, all without notifying the public or the authorities. At first, Formosa strenuously denied any link to the unfolding environmental disaster, and the Vietnamese government sided with the foreign firm. But eventually, faced with the mounting damage and growing public outcry, they changed their tune. Formosa Ha Tinh Steel was officially declared to be responsible for the incident. The offending company is an offshoot of a major multinational corporation, Formosa Plastics Group, Taiwan's largest industrial firm. The company, in theory, has plenty of money to compensate the victims for its toxic waste, from those who suffered health impacts to fishermen who lost their livelihoods. But 10 years later, few Vietnamese have gotten any compensation at all. It's bad enough that Formosa considers the issue closed, but the Vietnamese government has effectively sided with a foreign corporation and arrested those who dared to protest. While Vietnam's own government abandoned the fight, a diverse group of activists are pursuing legal options abroad where the Communist Party of Vietnam can't shut them down. Today, on The Diplomat Asia, we're looking at a true crime story where the culprit is clear, but justice has proven elusive. Stay tuned to learn about the worst environmental crisis to ever hit Vietnam, how the damage is still being felt today, and the people fighting for justice on behalf of the victims a decade later. Here's one of them.
My name is Nancy Bui. I'm the founder and VP of External Affairs for Justice for Formosa Victim Association. When I speak about Formosa victim, I'm not speaking as an outsider. I have sat down with the victim. I have listening to their story. I have seen the fear and the pain in their eyes. And I can tell you what happened in April 2016, not end in 2016, for millions of people in central Vietnam. It is still happening today. Here is their story.
It started as a mystery. On April 6, 2016, the seawater turned red, and millions of dead fish began washing up along the once pristine central coast of Vietnam. First, it was just a few in Ha Tinh province. But within weeks, the devastation had spread across 200 kilometers of coastline, choking beaches in Quang Binh, Quang Tri, and Tua Tin Hue. By the end of the month, approximately 80 tons, that's 80,000 kilograms, or over 175,000 pounds, of fish carcasses had washed up on Vietnamese shores. That's roughly equivalent to the weight of 15 elephants or 60 cars. By May 7th, the collected fish carcasses had surpassed 100 tons. Something was deeply, deeply wrong with the water off the coast of Vietnam. There were even reports of dead whales and other deep-sea animals, suggesting whatever was poisoning the marine life was spreading alarmingly far into the ocean. The damage wasn't limited to ocean-dwelling creatures. Hundreds of people in Vietnam were hospitalized after eating contaminated seafood. Some even died. On May 4th, 2016, the Vietnamese government announced a ban on processing and selling of seafood caught within 20 nautical miles of the central Vietnamese provinces, just one day after the Ministry of Natural Resources and Environment had claimed that the seafood in the region met safety standards. For months, fishermen all along Vietnam's central coast couldn't go out to ply their trade. The livelihoods of 4 million people were disrupted overnight. According to the local government of Quang Binh, the fishermen of that one province lost $5.2 million in just 1 month, from April to May 2016. What killed Vietnam's fish and decimated the local seafood industry? Suspicion immediately zeroed in on a sprawling multi-billion-dollar steel complex in Ha Tinh province owned by Formosa Ha Tinh Steel, a subsidiary of the Taiwanese conglomerate Formosa Plastics. Local fishermen noticed that the water in the area had turned abnormal colors. Upon investigation, divers found a massive underwater discharge pipe connected to the Formosa plant, which was aggressively spewing dark, toxic-smelling water into the sea. One of the divers sent to gather samples of the sludge sickened and died. For the locals, the culprit was obvious, but getting accountability was another story. When confronted by reporters in April 2016, a Formosa Ha Tinh Steel public relations official famously dismissed the pollution as the price of progress. While Formosa was still officially denying any responsibility, the executive seemed to make a tacit admission of guilt when he remarked that Vietnamese citizens had to choose between catching fish or building a modern steel industry. Before acquiring the land, we already advised local fishermen to change their jobs. Many times in life, people have to make a choice, either to catch and sell fish or to develop the steel industry. You cannot have both, he said. The sheer arrogance of the statement poured gasoline on already burning public outrage. But the Vietnamese government seemed determined to protect the foreign investor instead of its own citizens. Let's hear from Nancy Bui again.
The Vietnamese government sided with Formosa from the beginning and helped the company deny and cover up the disaster. Economic development was placed above environmental protection. Weak environmental law and corruption allow companies to avoid their responsibility. Formosa think that when they have the protection from the Vietnamese government, they can ignore everything. It's not right.
For weeks, Vietnamese officials offered a series of baffling deflections. They blamed the catastrophe on an algal bloom, commonly known as a red tide, or suggested it was the result of human-induced noise pollution, or even natural ocean currents. Anything, it seemed, but the massive steel plant that had been caught red-handed dumping waste into the ocean. State-run media largely ignored the mounting evidence against Formosa, and the government deployed security forces to stop journalists and independent scientists from testing the waters. Then, after months of dodging blame, there was a stunning reversal. On June 30th, 2016, the Vietnamese government held a nationally televised press conference. Formosa Ha Tinh Steel explicitly accepted responsibility for the disaster, admitting that toxic chemicals, including cyanide and phenol, had ended up in the ocean. Formosa issued a formal apology and agreed to pay a staggering $500 million in compensation. Why the sudden change of heart by both Vietnam's government and Formosa's local affiliate? The toxic waste dump had triggered the one thing the Communist Party of Vietnam fears most: mass protests. Between April and June 2016, Vietnam witnessed a protest movement unlike anything seen in decades. Fueled by the Formosa officials' arrogant "fish or steal" remark, social media platforms, particularly Facebook, came alive. Ordinary citizens, not just seasoned dissidents, changed their profile pictures to fish skeletons. Over successive weekends in May 2016, thousands of people took to the streets in Hanoi, Ho Chi Minh City, and provinces across the country. They marched peacefully, demanding transparency, environmental protection, and government accountability. For a brief moment, civil society in Vietnam had found its voice. It was a true environmental awakening, but it went way beyond environmental issues. The toxic waste incident dredged up questions about government and corporate accountability, corruption, and the rights of citizens. Vietnamese youth, long viewed as apolitical, were suddenly organizing, debating policy, and demanding a say in their country's future. Vietnam's government realized that if they didn't hold Formosa accountable, the anger of the people would soon turn against the Communist Party itself. But the $500 million fine on Formosa didn't start a new era of responsiveness to citizen protests. It was the government's effort to make the problem go away. Once Formosa took the fall, the government began a brutal crackdown on anyone who was still asking questions about environmental justice. The Communist Party viewed the environmental movement as a Trojan horse for democratic reform. Sensing a potential threat to its hold on power, the government unleashed a massive crackdown. Independent journalists and bloggers who had reported on the Formosa disaster were hunted down. Even scientific information about the disaster was tightly controlled. A comprehensive scientific investigation on the marine environment was conducted, but the result of the study was never released to the public. Authorities claimed the information was related to national security. On the same grounds, anyone who spoke up about the disaster faced arrest. Nancy explains.
They treated this disaster as national security matter. I want you to understand what that means. It means information is controlled. It means people cannot freely ask questions. It means if anyone dare to violate, their punishment will be severe. I have worked with the victim who told me they were afraid to speak, afraid to seek help. I have also seen that what happened to those who try to speak out. People protest peacefully. They ask for clean water, for answer, for justice, and many were arrested. Some received very long sentences, and And now, 10 years later, a dozen is still in prison today.
Prominent activists like Mother Mushroom, who had extensively documented the government's mishandling of the crisis, were arrested and sentenced to lengthy prison terms for conducting propaganda against the state. What evidence did the Vietnamese authorities have against Mother Mushroom? Documents found at her house included slogans like "Fish need water" and "Take legal action against Formosa." That was enough. Nguyen Van Hoa, a journalist who covered the Formosa protests, was sentenced to 7 years in prison for conducting propaganda against the state. Lê Dinh Luan, another citizen journalist who had covered the Formosa disaster, was arrested for activities attempting to overthrow the state in July 2017. He got 20 years in prison. Hoang Duc Binh, who helped organize fishermen to file lawsuits, received 14 years behind bars. Through these arrests and many others, Vietnam's government dismantled the networks that had formed during the protests. The authorities systematically arrested Vietnam's environmental defenders, completely burying the legacy of the Formosa disaster that had sparked the awakening in the first place. And that $500 million that Formosa paid, it went directly into the hands of the Vietnamese government, and many of the victims say they never saw a cent. Vietnam's government is notoriously corrupt, and there were widespread complaints that the money was pocketed by officials. Very little reached the victims. When Vietnam's government did shell out payments, it went to people in just one of the 4 affected provinces, Ha Tinh, leaving thousands without any compensation at all. Today, the beaches of central Vietnam are quiet again. The fish have returned, but they are not as abundant as before. Many who previously earned a living catching fish have had to migrate to other parts of Vietnam or even abroad, leaving behind their families in a desperate quest to make ends meet.
Where are the victims today? They are still struggling to build their lives, still carrying the impact of what happened. And many of them have to leave for other cities in the south or overseas to find work, leaving their children behind with relatives. Others are serving long prison sentences, while many remain on the run as the Vietnamese government continue to pursue them. They are still waiting for justice, waiting for fairness, waiting to be heard.
Meanwhile, the Formosa Ha Tinh Steel plant continues to operate. In fact, in May 2018, just 2 years after causing Vietnam's worst ever environmental disaster, the plant expanded, opening a second blast furnace. Vietnam's government has effectively and brutally prevented locals from seeking justice. But people are still fighting on their behalf by filing court cases in other jurisdictions. Over the past decade, Justice for Formosa Victims, the group founded by Nancy Bui, has filed lawsuits against the company in Taiwan, lobbied in the United States, and sent letters to the United Nations on behalf of the Vietnamese victims. The legal case in Taiwan is the most interesting. Taiwan is a proud democracy whose government likes to boast of its human rights record, especially in comparison to one-party, communist-ruled states like Vietnam and China. But Taiwan is also where Formosa Plastics is headquartered, and the company has faced little accountability at home for its horrible environmental track record abroad. A 2025 report labeled Formosa a serial offender against environmental regulations. The 2016 toxic waste dump in Vietnam wasn't the only example. Formosa has also been accused of poisoning the water near a plant in the U.S. state of Texas and dumping toxic waste in Cambodia. Justice for Formosa Victims saw a chance to get justice by taking Taiwan's government at its word and playing on its ambition to be seen as a human rights paragon.
When the justice was blocked inside Vietnam, we worked to bring the case to Taiwan. I was personally, along with other members of JFFV, involved in helping organize this effort, collecting evidence, connecting lawyers, working with victims, often quietly and under difficult conditions. But even then, the victims faced barriers. They were stopped from traveling. They were threatened. I remember clearly villages being monitored, loudspeaker warning people not to participate. At that point, it became clear to me this was not just a legal struggle. It was a fight simply to be heard.
In June 2019, some 7,800 victims, represented by a coalition of NGOs, including Justice for Formosa Victims, filed a lawsuit in Taiwan against Formosa Plastics. At first, the case was rejected due to the argument that Taiwanese courts lacked jurisdiction over an environmental disaster in Vietnam. But upon appeal all the way up to Taiwan's Supreme Court, eventually the plaintiffs secured a milestone ruling. On October 18, 2020, the Supreme Court authorized foreign nationals to sue Taiwanese actors, like Formosa Plastics Group, in Taiwanese courts when they cannot sue in the country of origin, like Vietnam, which is famous for its tightly controlled justice system. The victims, at long last, saw hope for real compensation, but their hopes were soon dashed yet again. Formosa wanted to make things difficult for the plaintiffs, so it demanded that the victims certify their Taiwan-based attorneys as their legal representatives by physically filing extra paperwork within Vietnam, specifically at Taiwan's representative office in Hanoi. In making the request, Formosa must have known this would be impossible to do. The Vietnamese government would make sure none of the plaintiffs ever reached their destination. In late 2024, about 50 victims tried to travel to Hanoi to authenticate the power of attorney, or POA, for the lawsuit in Taiwan, as the Taiwanese courts had required. They were stopped and warned that they could be arrested if they continued.
The government of Vietnam, they don't want that. They prohibit and threaten anybody go through this process could be arrested and in prison for long term. We secretly send 2 lawyers from Taiwan, 2 lawyers from US to sign the POA between the lawyer and the victim. But they don't recognize it. They still make an extra step that make the victim risk their life. So we are having difficult at Taiwan court.
The legacy of the Formosa disaster in 2016 remains a dark chapter in Vietnam's modern history. It proved that while the Vietnamese people are willing to fight fiercely for their environment, the state is willing to fight even harder to maintain its absolute grip on power. To revisit the Formosa executive's infamous quote, "When offered the choice between a healthy ocean and steel, the government chose steel." And it made sure the Vietnamese people would never have the power to choose otherwise. Vietnam's response is unsurprising, but advocates have been disappointed by the roadblocks to justice in Taiwan, a bastion of democracy and human rights in East Asia. Activists like Bui are still fighting on behalf of the Vietnamese victims. Later this year, she will travel to Taiwan to protest during the 10-year anniversary of the disaster. Hopefully, it will do some good.
I have spent years working with these victims. I have seen their strength, their patience, their hope. They are not asking too much. They are just asking for the truth, for fairness, for a chance to rebuild their life, their community. And I believe they deserve that. The victims are still waiting. Your voice matters. Government can apply pressure. Organization can advocate. People can share this story because when the world pay attention, things can change.
Thanks for watching The Diplomat Asia. For more about the intersection of the environment, human rights, and politics in Southeast Asia, check out our video on how China's rare earth mines are poisoning rivers in Myanmar and beyond.